IVM.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Megha Pardhi. I'm currently working as a research analyst in Takshashila Institution. Today I'll be talking with Harshit Kukreja, who is my colleague at Takshashila. And we'll be talking about China's recent guidelines regarding human genetic resources. So welcome, Harshit.
Yeah, hi. So before we start and before we forget, just wanted to plug in Takshashila's public policy courses. They are now open. The graduate certificate in public policy is a 3-month course. There are 3 specializations from which you can choose: defense and foreign affairs, tech and policy, and advanced public policy. So it's a really good course. I did 2 of them in 2020. You can check them out.
Okay, now that we are done with branding, let's move on to our discussion. So Harshit, last week, Ministry of Science and Technology in China released this, guidelines to basically regulate.
Why was there a extra emphasis on guidelines?
Yeah, because guidelines, because there are only different types of things, there are regulations, there are guidelines. So earlier in 2019, there was already a regulation released by State Council of China. But now these are the guidelines which are released by implementing agency, that is or key agency, that is Ministry of Science and
Are
Technology.
guidelines optional in China? Or
Well, optional, no. They're called guidelines, but they're kind of compulsory.
yeah, that was the point I wanted to clear here. Obviously, welcome to China.
Yeah.
So you were telling about the new guidelines on genetic databases, right?
Yeah, as I said, these guidelines were released. So, a little background first. In November 2018, around that time, there is a scientist in China who declared that he has now successfully, made designer babies. When I say designer babies, basically he had performed a human experiment on human babies, like gene editing on human babies, and his experiment was successful. So that created a lot of controversy, and immediately after a few months.
Megha, were the babies Gucci or Armani?
Please come on.
Yes, sir.
We're not talking about that kind of designer here. We are talking about, this is a fancy term actually. This should not be,
No.
not.
They're known as designer babies all over the world.
Yeah,
So-
this is like kind of an informal term which is used.
So Chinese scientists do have a lot of freedom when it comes to experimentation, right? When it comes to science, I don't think there's a lot of.
As long as you are doing, as long as you're following ministry's guidelines, as I said, as long as you're going where kind of government wants you to go. So yeah,
So
until then you do have freedom.
So thus a thought came to my mind: is there a migration of researchers who have been restricted by, maybe, I think Europe has a lot of restrictions on genetic modified organisms, a lot of restriction on using stem cells. India does not a lot of regulation right now, but is there a migration of scientists who want to work and who want this freedom to China from the Western world or from countries like India?
Yeah, of course, there is a lot of migration, but let me come back to the guidelines first. So, yeah, I was talking about why this controversy was there. So, this was first of its kind, first of all. No one had done experiments on human anywhere in the world. And so, this created, of course, controversy, and the Chinese government was not happy about it. So, they jailed him, and later they also, I think, gave him a sentence to be jailed for 3 or 4 years or something. So now coming back to your question, is there a migration? So sometimes there are a lot of factors that go into migration of scientists, but academic freedom is also one of them. I mean, of course, the situation is changing a little because of government's push to, get back scientists and researchers. But that's the case now. So these guidelines were actually released like based on this 2019 regulations. And also recently China also had promulgated data protection law and biosecurity.
China has a data protection law? Question mark.
Yes.
So it is very interesting that China has a data protection law and we don't. Never mind. Back to designer babies regulation. Consequences of designer babies.
Okay, so it's the designer baby regulations. Let me, clarify that for
Let,
our
let
listeners.
us rename it to Gucci babies regulation. It is now GBR. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So okay, first of all, it's a draft. The guidelines are not finalized yet. It was released last week and they have been open for public consultation. And again, before you ask, yes, there's supposed public consultation in China also. So that's supposed to be till April 21 and how there'll be further action.
So
Yeah. So
no, even
we're
if you Mega, just a second. So even if
yeah.
I send my comments, they would have a some kind of a website, right? Where they post the draft and you can send emails similar to what we have in India. You can send emails and you can call and you can write, right? Something
I
some
think so open for public consultation for Chinese nationals, not
yeah,
for
obviously. So if I'm residing in China, I'm a Chinese national, and
yeah.
if I send something, so as long as I don't make my views public, even if they oppose the guidelines, that should be all right, right?
Technically, yes. I mean, in the notification itself, there is an email ID where you're supposed to send your, comments and basically put your feedback you want.
Yeah. But I don't think if I would like take this risk.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, what do you think? It's
Uh,
China.
yeah.
Probably. So, I don't reside in Beijing. So, but still, as far as I know,
Yeah,
you're free to send your comments
we
as you're
should we should
Chinese
ask
national.
Manoj sometime. We'll ask him and
Exactly. Yeah. So now again getting back to designer babies, as you said. So this law is basically just not about designer babies. It contains regulations and guidelines about all the genetic material or human genetic resources as they're called here. Which actually, you can tell more about what exactly consists of human genetic resources. Like quick.
yeah. So from my understanding of what they meant in the law was anything which gives out DNA. So anything they used it as a very broad sort of a definition. I've never heard that somebody using a phrase as human genetic resources. So they have used it in a very broad manner. They have included everything from what I've read in English. I don't know Mandarin, so I don't have the exact whatever copy. Though I have not read the original copy, so, what I've read is they've included everything. They want to regulate genetic banks where you store your DNAs, where if you, they want to regulate all sort of stem cells banks. They want to regulate places where you store sort of organs. But it is a very broad definition. Did I miss something? Do you want to add?
No. So I had read about that. I mean, definition did contain organ cells, tissues, that kind of thing, and also data which is derived from these kind of resources like
So that is like
genetic information.
basically everything.
Yes, so data. And if, for example, I take your tissue tomorrow, and so your tissue would also be a resource, and the data which I get after analyzing your tissue, that is also a resource.
Yeah. But I don't think I would be comfortable giving my genetic data to you, Mega.
Not if they
I,
make.
yeah, maybe.
Yeah, so there is a provision actually in the law that this survey kind of thing would be conducted every 5 years, and there will be different authorities assigned to conduct this kind of survey. And the overall management of this whole, project or basically, I wouldn't say just project, but including survey and laws and then There are also supposed to be permits and all the whole legal framework. So management of this human genetic resource would be done under the provincial governments and their science and technology committees and bureaus. And for Xinjiang region, there is also Science and Technology Bureau of Xinjiang Production and Construction. Yes.
So,
So
Mega, just adding on that. So, the
Hmm.
India also has a similar DNA technology regulation bill. In that bill, we also have a provision which says that that bill is basically for if we want to identify a person. So, it says the law says that if you are facing a crime in which you will face probably 7 years or more of jail time, then the government can force you to give out your genetic material. So it's similar to Chinese survey, but for identifying criminals, for gathering evidence and stuff like that. Yeah, back to the designer baby regulation bill.
Yes. So, in this guideline, okay, this first of all, this is not a regulation bill as such. This is a guideline.
Oh, sorry, my
Because
bad.
this is not going to be converted into law. This is a guideline. Now, there's a different law actually, the biosecurity law, which already passed, I think, last year, which has similar provisions, by the way. So, in this guideline, what is allowed, this is something different from what you explained, what happens in India. So, under this guideline, scientific research is allowed. This data can be used for development of biomedical industries or improving diagnostic services or for the development of therapeutic technology. So these kind of activities are allowed. And for basically, the term they have used is rational use of human genetic resource. And
So,
I found that quite interesting.
yeah. So, what do you mean by rational use? Is there an
Actually,
irrational
I,
use?
yeah, I mean, irrational use would be you're using, for example, unethical human experiments which you're doing,
Yeah, but
altering.
making designer
Exactly, the
babies was
designer babies, that concept is
that
apparently
was
not rational.
that was very ethical, huh?
I mean, yeah, probably for the parents who want cricketers and actors and Albert
No, no, no.
Einstein
So the
from human
designer
perspective.
babies, well, the term it has a lot of applications. For instance, you have a disorder. There are basically two types of genetic disorders. I'm simplifying it too much, but there are basically two types of genetic disorders. One is a recessive disorder, and one is a dominant disorder. Okay, so if you have the gene for a recessive disorder and your partner also has the gene for the recessive disorder, the probability of your offspring getting that disorder, that recessive disorder increases a lot. So designer babies also includes that concept in which before implantation of the ovum, what we want to do is we want to take out that gene and make sure that your offspring doesn't have that recessive disorder. So there are applications other than looking good and being tall. But I don't think looking good and being tall is sort of unethical. Is it unethical? If I want my kids, if I'm short, I'm like 4'10" or 4'11", and I want my kids to have a better height. So is it unethical?
So you know what? I really don't have answer to this because
No, no,
this
ethical
is a
questions.
classic kind of case of. So of course the medical application part of it, I sort of agree that if you know a complication, if it's going to make human life better, like by removing a disease or
So
genetic deformity,
So it would make the child's life a lot better if he's 6 feet.
that
It
is a
is a very
social that is
quantity.
social
No, no, no.
norm.
It is a very no.
Say the height
No, no. Maybe maybe he wants to play basketball, and all the shelves in his house are at 6 feet of height. So some reason. So I don't think that is sort of a very bad or unethical thing to maybe well, there are a lot of concerns that, first of all, we don't know all the things, leave all the things. We will know very little about what particular genes lead to what, and things like that. And it would be very difficult for us to like have physical traits. And if we remove a gene, what will happen? How will we replace it? And things like that. And there are a lot of consequences to this. So but I don't think it would be unethical. So
So
yeah,
that's kind of a very so difficult question to ponder on in in scope of our podcast. But yeah, so these kind of ethical questions have actually bugged a lot of people, and I think they also bugged the lawmakers or the people who were writing these guidelines because they have included requirements for ethical review and safeguarding rights and interests of people to maintain their privacy or genetic resource this genetic providers, so genetic material providers, sorry. So I think these kind of questions were also in their mind. That's why they're included in the guidelines. There are
so
also a lot of requirements regarding, qualifications on who can do what, which individuals can conduct experiments, or which organizations can collect these kind of materials. So I think they have included these in guidelines so that there is kind of no
so
ambiguity regarding
mega
who has.
foreign. I think foreign companies and organizations are not allowed, right? Like there's a
Uh,
blanket.
foreign, no, no, no. So for yeah, I was coming to this next point. So in actually, so there is a little keyword here. In 2019, regulation which was issued by State Council was outright banned that no foreign entity would be or foreign unit would be involved. But this is my preliminary observation on this guideline that here there is a provision of international cooperation, and this was also present in the biosecurity law, by the way, that if international cooperation or international kind of research has to be carried out, then there has to be a cooperation agreement. There has to be a procedure to be followed. It has to be cleared with Minister of Science and Technology, and the organizations should kind of team up with the Chinese organizations, and then only they have to share data, they have to create backups of data. So there are a lot of provisions. I mean, there is a lot of baggage, but there is also a provision that there can be some international
I think
cooperation.
it would be a lot more clear when maybe 6 months or a year down the line, when we look at what collaborations they allow and what they restrict.
Yeah, so these are guidelines right now. When these guidelines will be finalized and when they'll be actually implemented, we'll get a clearer picture of what exactly is being done in this regard.
Yeah, I think then we would have a better idea. But I
Yep.
don't think
So
the Chinese would allow data about their population to reside, to go in foreign hands.
yeah, so this is something actually, kind of being debated and discussed on, so that there is a sensitivity involved in sharing, this kind of genetic data of your population, because that can very easily be used to make bioweapons. So, of course, there will be some hesitation to, share this kind of data, especially if your ethnic diversity of a place or a region
Mega,
is.
I think bioweapons targeted to a specific population are still at least 20, 30 years down the line. And
Probably. Yeah, but that possibility cannot be denied.
I
In
don't
fact,
think it's a very real possibility. The possibility that by not sharing data about their population, you are basically causing a lot of harm, because a lot of guidelines and a lot of research is done on the Caucasian population,
hmm,
the Western European and North American population. So we don't have a data about basically anybody else, better, well, a good data about anybody else. So if you don't allow others to like compare with your data, see what are the differences, and we don't, our knowledge about genetics is quite rudimentary at this stage. So it would be very difficult for them, however we assume the Chinese to be, but it will be like very difficult for them if they don't share data and they don't get insights from outside to get like very good applications. Maybe, so we were talking about bioweapons, right? So if the Chinese like do a lot of genetic testing. They do whole genomes and exomes and everything like that, and they let that data sort of in a public repository or something and allow everybody access to it. So then maybe it's sometime down the line we would have guidelines and we will have drugs, we would have vaccines which are sort of adapted to that data. Will we'll have a very better understanding of what diseases Chinese suffer and what can we do to elevate them. Same. So, uh,
Actually, I'm glad that you mentioned this open data thing. So, in the guidelines, I did come across one or two places a provision for open use of genetic information by foreign organizations and individuals, or in case you have to send data abroad in emergency cases. So, I didn't quite get it exactly, but ultimately it indicated that in emergency cases it would be allowed, but it should pass security review of most. So yeah, that was there.
emergency cases, that would be like individual cases where you want to know, for instance, the baby is in the womb and you want to know that if the baby is suffering from a genetic condition and you want to see if you want to like continue the pregnancy and things like that. That I think from my reading, that meant for very specific individual cases. That is not for population level data.
Probably. I mean, I don't know what the scope of this emergency case is as of now. But interestingly, I mean, when we're talking about whole genocide and bioweapons, not exactly the same thing. But I did remember that this one of the organization, not organization, but yeah, one of the management responsibilities which is given to the regional organization. So that is for Xinjiang region. That is Xinjiang Production and Construction Code. That is also called XPCC. So this actually has been sanctioned by United Nations, Department of Treasury for involvement in human right abuses and literally kind of accusations of genocide, kind of
Yeah,
what's
Mega,
happening in Xinjiang.
I think you meant United States Department of Treasury,
Yeah,
right?
sorry. I'm
Yeah.
so sorry. Yeah, I meant United States Department of
Yeah.
Treasury.
So the organization which is sort of managing genetic resources is a human rights abuser.
Yeah, so that was I was
That
kind of
is
shocked by that.
that is a very nice thought. So Mega will continue this. First, let us take a short break. So listeners, will meet you again after a short break.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cock and Bull on Cyrus Says, Cyrus talks to Gauri Devi Dayal, host of This Round Is On Me, along with Abbas Momin and Antarix. They congratulate Gauri on the fact that her restaurant The Table made it to the top 50 restaurants in Asia, and discuss the Oscars debacle over Will Smith slapping Chris Rock. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam introduces us to Anubhav Jain, CEO and co-founder at Groupify. They unravel how the BNPL service is solving SME's cash flow. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik talks to Pamela Kale Malhotra, co-founder and trustee of the Sai Sanctuary. Karthik asks her how a girl from New Jersey grew up with the dream of starting a wildlife sanctuary. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshav takes us on a trip to the land of Buddhist monks and Danny Denzongpa, Gang Talk. And on the Life Manifesto, Zarina talks about developing 4 must-have qualities for a better life. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you might be listening to us on. And do check us out on YouTube. We're building a whole bunch of different channels. You can find them on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And we're also doing a small listener survey, which we would really appreciate your help with. It helps us kind of talk to advertisers. So you could go to ivmpodcast.com/survey. It'll just take a couple of minutes and it would be really helpful to us. We do appreciate this. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance and the India Water Portal. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Hey, and welcome back to All Things Policy. We were talking about a Chinese guideline, supposedly guidelines, which they made after a scientist made designer babies. They want to regulate genetic data. We were talking about that. So, Megha, you were talking about how the organization which is supposed to oversee management of genetic resources in a province in China has been sanctioned, right?
Yeah, so this was sanctioned, I think, in 2020, around something like there was a whole lot of sanctions on entities operating from Xinjiang region, and those were involved in, basically oppressing Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So when I was reading through the document, and I read that, I thought this seems familiar, and I just googled it, and oh, there it was. It was sanctioned. Yeah, so I just kind of popped up, and so for us, probably this might be something which feels weird that, okay, an organization which is accused of human right abuses is handling such a sensitive data. But I think for the internal workings or internal operation purposes, that's the most reliable agency for that province, for them at least.
So, Megha, you labeled the data as sensitive. I don't think we agree on this part of genetic data being sensitive. I believe
Mhm.
that it should be like open and free because it will lead to a lot of the risk of, I think, bioweapons or targeted weapons is quite less as compared to the benefits of what that data and could bring to the population. So it's, for instance, you get a home. They are now supposedly, they're not supposedly, they are home DNA tests. So you book a test, you get a swab, you take the your cheek swab, you put it in the whatever plastic packet, you send it back, and the organization sends you back a list which says that, oh, so you are at maybe 75% risk of early onset Alzheimer's. You are at a risk of maybe some malignancy, some cancer. So that data is that explanations, that interpretations are based on Western data on Western populations. So if we go the China way and we try to like keep data inside, be Atmanirbhar with our data and have that angle that maybe we'll get weaponized biological weapons if we give out our genetic data. I think we'll miss out all of this where you can evaluate your risk and maybe sometimes you could get drugs personalized to your genetic makeup. So you have
Mhm.
fewer side effects. You have to take
Mm.
less dosage and those drugs are like specifically tailor made for you. So you get better like really fast.
Yeah, so as interesting as these applications are, I mean, I would really love to see a world where any kind of information is not weaponized. But one of my topic is also related to how information is weaponized. So I kind of feel that, or no, maybe I'm just studying too much military and military related, defense related stuff these days. But I'm kind of skeptical about it because it's an experience or maybe a history is an evidence that whenever there is even iota of possibility of some technology or some information being weaponized in extreme and urgent cases, it will be. I mean, look at this DJI example, for example. So there is this Chinese company DJI which sells, this drones, small drones, which are not supposed to be used for military purposes. Now, in this war going on with Ukraine, they are so there is this functionality. It's called aeroscope, which tells you location of each drone. So what Ukrainians are doing, they are using this civilian drones, literally toy drones, to track movement of Russian convoys and that kind of information. And of course, they have right to defend and use whatever technology they want or they can. But in a retaliation, there is an allegation that Russia is using that aeroscope functionality to track each civilian drone and then target them. So you never know in case of, I may be being paranoid, but whenever it
Yeah.
comes to, that point, whenever
Yeah.
push comes to shove, your information and this kind of things can be
So,
misused.
so Mega, tell me three symptoms of a heart attack. What do you think are, whatever ever have you heard or whatever you think are the symptoms of a heart attack?
Okay, I'm not a doctor, but I only know because I watch series. I've
Uh,
seen it on TV that
yeah, that's all
you
right. Yeah, what is
you
your
feel chest pain
okay?
and you have this your left arm starts
Very
stops
nice.
even quick and yeah, I just know two. No, sorry, I don't know three.
Take it. That's all right. So, do you know that current health data is based on, first of all, obviously Western populations, and is based
Mm-hmm.
on males. So,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of females present as atypical MI, myocardial infarction, atypical heart attacks.
Okay.
So, because that should not be called atypical because females are half the population. So, the
Okay.
presentation that people in the general population know is
Hmm.
what is based on male population, male subset. So, this is true for a lot of diseases. So,
Okay.
for
So
a lot, yeah,
you're saying that the information which is most popularly known is based on a very small data set and very limited data set,
So
which
the
was
same, yeah. So the same logic applies to genetic data also and health data in general, that they are based on Western Caucasian populations. And India, we are not a very large research, biological research, genetic powerhouse. So if we want that we get interpretations that are specific to our population, we'll have to share the data with the world so that they can compare the data with their population, see what is the difference. So it's sort of like for instance, there are 100 sequences on one data set and there are 100 sequences on the other. So we know like very little about what they do. So what we do is
Hmm.
you take one person who is a Caucasian person who lives in somewhere in Sweden. He has asthma. Okay. You compare that to, I'm oversimplifying this. I'm like super oversimplifying this. And you compare that to one person who has asthma in India. So when you compare the sequences, you see that, oh, so the gene at position 64, this gene X is also there in position maybe 64 on that Caucasian gene set, data set. So now we know that this is the gene which is somehow implicated in asthma pathology and maybe is the cause or is somehow related. Obviously, you don't compare one on one. One is a very small data selection, it's a very small subset. This is done across large populations. So you do that and then you get interpretations, you compare similarities, you compare differences. So if we go the China way and look at the possibility that maybe our data will be weaponized, then we are losing on a lot of benefits. So when you know that asthma is caused by this X gene, so you can tailor make drugs which target this gene.
So I think, I mean, your point is actually very valid. I just want to comment a little on this China
Obviously,
bit.
Mega, it's
Uh,
my point. It would be valid here.
yeah. So on the China bit, I don't think that they're worried about data being weaponized. I think they're using it more like a strategic reserve, a strategic resource. I mean, they can, so the more they have control over this kind of resource, more they can use it to their advantage. Maybe whatever they have. Like, I don't know what they have in their mind, but whatever it is. And
Then
this
that,
kind of has been, so then to view anything like data like this, or even the resource like this, to view as a strategic resource is kind of probably would be a thinking behind, also behind this kind of guideline.
yeah, I'm not like entirely convinced, but maybe not. I'm not very sure that how they can use genetic resource of their population as a strategic source.
Maybe that's what time will tell us how it can be used. I just don't. I just wish that we don't have to see a day where entire country's population data is being used to some horrible purpose.
That sounds like a plot of a sci-fi film, uh,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is now
So
made in China for Chinese population.
yeah, let's take a little break from China now, and I really want to know about how we are like what's the status of genetic resources,
In India,
data in India. Yeah.
so in India, we don't have a sort of a policy. ICMR, Indian Council for Medical Research, has ethical guidelines for research involving human participants. I think the latest was updated sometime in 2017. So we have guidelines. It has all that that you have to pass any genetic research, any basically any health research you do. This covers all genetic research. Any research you do via ethical committee and the normal, the basically whatever is in the Chinese sort of whatever the Chinese proposed in the guidelines, somewhat similar to that. But we don't have a regulation or a law or a guideline which says that how can you use data as a, there are no restrictions on health data as such. There's some guidelines. There was a DNA technology regulation bill 2019. So that is basically to identify a person, missing persons, gather evidence and stuff like that. It is not about how the data can be used. So a lot of genetic data was supposedly to be covered in the personal data protection bill. The personal data protection bill has still not been passed. I think we discussed this earlier in this podcast. It still has not been passed. So we are awaiting that. We don't have a policy which says that we have not used our genetic resources as a strategic resource as of now. But the part which is worrying is there are like genetic resource banks coming up in India. A lot of, I think one was paid for by the government, not a very large genetic data bank. It was, I think, around 1,000 people or something. And there are a lot of banks which are propped up by organizations, private organizations, by non-profits and such. But we don't have a law which regulates privacy. So we don't know that if you put data in that, if you give out your genetic data in that resource, will that be sold? How will that be used? Will that be put in public domain? There is some specific discussion about this in the guidelines, the ICMR guidelines, but Indian guidelines are not like Chinese guidelines. They're sort of guidelines and optional, and a lot of people don't follow them. So we have no concrete policy, and our data's privacy is basically at risk. We should have some kind of regulation which says that, which basically covers privacy and continuing consent for genetic data. It should cover everything like research, individual. Maybe for instance, it's a use case. You put your data in one of the biobanks, genetic banks, and then can that biobank send your data to police for identification? Can it? Can it not? Nobody knows. So there are no regulations and there are no per se guidelines. We are
Okay, so we have like some guidelines which roughly are like there
they're
just
not
because it's
specific
something
to
out there.
genetic. They're not specific to genomic data. They're just
Okay, so they are just general guidelines.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so this is quite interesting. I mean, at least, yeah, but as I said, we should have some detailed, the one I read by MOS to China was, I mean, it's so detailed. It's like huge 70-page document. It includes everything. I mean, literally everything. Definitions of foreign entities to definition of individuals and what organizations can be. So yeah, I think this has been quite an interesting discussion. And on this note, I think we should stop here.
Yeah, it was quite a informative one, and I think Megha, you should read less about military applications and geopolitics and more about
Well, that's my
stories
job,
with.
Harshit, about military application.
I think you should read more about stories with happy endings, maybe fairy tales or fiction. I have some good fiction books. I think you can borrow them because you have grown too cynical, and I'm a little scared of
Yeah.
So-
Thank you so much for joining us today, Harshit.
It was very fun doing this. Okay, bye.
Bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Are you looking for finance products and services that can enhance your personal finance experience? Are you looking for a space to talk about your financial product or service? And are you looking for a crisp talk show where the conversation is all about money? Well, your search ends here. Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta and I'm host of the Paisa Paisa podcast, and I invite you for the conversation about your personal finance on each Monday on the IVM Podcast app or the website or on any podcast streaming platforms. See you folks.
Working Monday to Friday glued to your chair making you feel dull? Worry not. Get your 5-minute weekly dose of travel around the world with postcards from nowhere. Join me every Thursday as I explore the strange, obscure, and fascinating parts of the world and bring out facets of travel you may not have thought of before. You can find us on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.